Today my wife became my boss and fired me in short order. My wife didn't actually say I was fired. She explicitly told me that if I did not agree with her decision regarding my job, I would be fired. However, what she wanted me to do was too humiliating, so I agreed to be fired. Jenny, my wife of 20 years, and I were married shortly after we both started working for Hammett Communications. It was a corporation that owned radio and television stations as well as the premium cable network. The cable network covered 12 states and had plans to expand to 10 more. Jenny was only 3 days younger than me, and although we had never met at school, we attended the same grammar school. She was about 5 feet 60 centimeters tall and weighed about 110 pounds. Jenny had silky brown hair and soft brown eyes. She was pretty, intelligent, and had a great smile. I had no romantic interest in her at first, but the more we worked together, the more I liked her. I was 5 feet 10 inches and 170 pounds with sandy-colored hair. I never thought of myself as beautiful or ugly, I was just me. Jenny and I spent our last semester of high school as interns at Atlanta radio station WJTR-FM. As interns, Jenny and I were bounced from one department to another. It was fun and we both learned a lot. Jenny enjoyed the sales department the most. She enjoyed the freedom to plan her day and spend time out of the office. I, on the other hand, found that I enjoyed working in the production department. The thought of being able to use my creativity and sense of humor just turned me on. However, I wasn't allowed to do much. In fact, for 2 weeks, I became the ringleader. Nevertheless, I kept a close eye on everything that was going on in the department, learned how to operate all the equipment, and learned about the rules and prohibitions of writing commercials. It was an amazing 9 weeks and I learned a lot about the radio station. Towards the end of the semester, Jenny and I started dating. We were both 18 at the time, and we were both passionate about radio. However, the decision to get married was made because of a passion of a different kind. Jenny was pregnant. It was difficult at first, as we struggled to get by on 2 meager paychecks. We both took jobs at WJTR, a 20,000-watt FM station serving the Atlanta metropolitan area and its suburbs. Jenny was a sales assistant and I was hired as a weekend night DJ. I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Chad Jameson, and although I hated the long hours and only mildly enjoyed DJing, I knew it was basically a shitty job. The job was basically playing music, reporting the time and weather, and reading events from our local community calendar. Of course, I had to intersperse all of this with commercials, lineups, and infomercials. I worked Friday and Saturday nights from midnight to 8 a.m. The hardest part of the job was staying awake, but there was one huge advantage: I could use the production studio to practice. But working as a part-time DJ didn't bring in enough money. So I had to find a second job. The economy was in recession, so finding any kind of job was difficult. And I was getting a little desperate, especially since Jenny was now staying home with our daughter, Tiffany. Ever since Tiffany came along, we'd been living on handouts from our parents, and I hated it. Luckily, I got a full-time job at a local hardware store. The store was owned by a married couple, John and Helen Mickelson. They were a wonderful couple and treated me like a son. John had a carpentry store in the back of the store where he made custom furniture. In the 2 years I worked there, John taught me a lot of things: carpentry, electrical, and even a little plumbing. But my passion was still radio. WJTR was a top 40 station at the time, so we had a limited number of songs we were allowed to play, which made the night shift even more boring. Computer automation was not yet widespread, so the station needed DJs on duty 24 hours a day. But I knew my weekend job wouldn't last long. I read Broadcasting Magazine regularly and knew it was only a matter of time before WJTR implemented computer automation at the station. When they converted, I would be out of a job. So during the night schedule, I worked even harder, honing my production and ad writing skills. My shift ended at 8 a.m., but from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., we used network programs that came through satellite. So all I had to do during the network programs was take meter readings every half hour. The rest of the time I was able to hone my skills. I used commercials running on the air as a template. I was simply creating a different version of what was already on the air. At first, My efforts were pathetic. But as time went on, I improved. And when I let my creativity and ingenuity flow, I felt I was as good as any of the production staff. Finally, I chose 3 commercials that seemed good to me and took them to the station manager. He liked all 3 and immediately turned them on for the sponsors, who wanted my version to replace the one that was on the air. The station manager wasn't going to offer me a job based on 3 commercials, so he told me I could work as a backup until I proved myself. This created a difficult situation for me because all 3 commercials I had done had replaced commercials done by Jason Stills. He was one of the staffers in the production department. He and I never got along because when I was a DJ, I complained about his commercials several times. He would periodically record over cartridge tape or record on defective cartridges. It was really bad. He was fired a week after my commercials replaced his when he accidentally erased the agency's commercials. After Jason left, I was hired part-time in production. Since I was now working at the radio station 4 hours a day, I had to reduce my hours at the hardware store. John and Helen took this very kindly, although John seemed a little disappointed with my decision. They had no children, and I think John had thoughts of me taking over the running of the store. But, as I said, radio was my passion. Nevertheless, I maintained a close relationship with John and Helen over the years, even having them over for Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner every year. And that relationship helped me many years later. I apologize for getting into this story, but I think you can see my passion for radio. In her 20s, Jenny had a career in sales and I pursued a career in production. But in the back of my mind, I always wanted to own a radio station. I even discussed it with Jenny a few times, but she wasn't interested at all. As she put it, why would I want to go from the #1 radio station in Atlanta to some rundown station in the middle of nowhere? So I put those ambitions to the back of my mind and continued my career at Hammett Communications. And that's how we got to where we are today. Currently, Jenny is the regional sales manager for radio and I was the regional production manager for radio. Jenny was aiming for the position of VP of radio sales, and I was sure I would become VP of production. However, 3 men, Bert Jones, Simon Sanders, and Todd Wankler, were ready to turn my life upside down. Bert Jones was executive vice president of radio and Simon Sanders was my boss and current vice president of radio production. Todd Wankler was a relative newcomer from our sister station KJTW-FM in San Francisco and was named my assistant, although I didn't ask for, nor did I want him, especially Todd. Todd annoyed me as a suck-up from the beginning. Supposedly, he was the golden boy in San Francisco. Nevertheless, I found it telling that the station readily sent him to Atlanta. Upon arrival, he complained bitterly about how crappy the East Coast was and how wonderful everything was in California. I eventually learned that he was sent because he had caused 3 divorces at the station. As much as I disliked him, I had to admit that Todd was a very good producer when he got down to it. For me, however, it was too infrequent. He only wanted to work with big clients, so he was constantly shifting small orders to other production staff. Since Todd was the assistant production manager, most people didn't dare say no to him. But I was the production manager, and I was delegating the work, so I resented what he was doing and put a stop to it. Todd was a real ladies' man. He was 5'2", broad-shouldered, with wavy black hair. The dress code in the produce department was fairly loose. Men wore plaid shirts and slacks. Women could wear slacks or a skirt and blouse. Todd always wore a suit and tie, which was pretty silly since he always took off his jacket and tie during the day. After Todd arrived, I noticed a lot of the women started wearing dresses and using more makeup. Eventually I had to send out a memo about the inappropriate cleavage that was being displayed. My wife always dressed up, and so did all the salespeople. They often had to meet with clients from big companies and were required to look professional. And nothing my wife wore was ever inappropriate. Todd was lazy and quick to blame others for his mistakes. His only real interest was in charming female coworkers, and he spent quite a bit of time flirting with any pretty female coworker, including my wife. And when I complained to Jenny, she just brushed me off and started defending Todd. I dropped the subject, but kept an eye on my assistant. When I discovered one day that Todd was changing my production schedule and putting his favorites at the head of the queue, I was furious. We have a lot of commercials that are time sensitive. It could be a one-day special and the commercial has to be shown the day before. When I discovered that we were almost out of time for several of these important commercials, I wanted to know why. After discussing the matter with several staff members, I learned that Todd had moved them up in the schedule. However, when I complained to my boss and offered to fire Todd, he refused. Simon explained that Old Man Hammett liked Todd, and when the San Francisco station wanted to let him go, he brought him to Atlanta. He told people that Todd reminded him of himself as a young man. Knowing that the Hammett family was very religious, I was shocked. Mr. Hammett fucked married women when he was young? No, Simon said, then grinned. At least, I'm pretty sure he never has. I think he just sees Todd as an energetic young man who works hard to get ahead. In fact, when I think about it, I doubt the people at KJTR told Mr. Hammett about Todd's association with married women. Management probably feared that if they threw Todd under the bus, Mr. Hammett might throw them under as well. I was stuck with Todd, and I didn't like it. So I had a Sunday come to Jesus style meeting with him. After that, I thought he'd get over it. But unbeknownst to me, he started doing it behind my back again. But now he was more selective in who he put in charge of the production line. Anyone in a higher position than me was given that special treatment. And Todd had included my wife, probably to tease me. Eventually I realized he was interfering, and I was ready to drop an arrow on Todd, regardless of Mr. Hammett's opinion. Todd nailed the spot that was going to start running the next day. Although the spot was for a relatively small company, it was part of a much larger conglomerate that did a lot of business with us. I had to stay up late and do the commercial myself. I thought he was going to get fired. But that's when it all went downhill for me. Like I said, Burt Jones, Simon Sanders and Todd Wankler turned my world upside down. But the blame for what happened to me doesn't lie with any of those three. It all started when Simon died suddenly of a heart attack on Sunday night. Everyone was shocked and the production department descended into chaos for half a day. Simon had left a long list of commercials to be shot, but no one knew all the details of what the sponsors wanted. As his assistant, I stepped in, prepared detailed information on each sponsor and got things back on track. Very quickly, the production department was running efficiently again. Having taken responsibility for making sure the production department didn't miss a beat, I was sure I was slotted for the VP position. But then the second shoe fell. On Friday, Burt Jones announced that he was resigning effective immediately. Simon's death shook him, and he decided to spend more time with his family. When word of his resignation was sent out, he announced that he had nominated Jenny to take his place. On Monday, the executive committee approved her promotion. I was happy for my wife and was sure she would do a great job, but what happened next was crushing. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I received a text message that Jenny wanted to see me in her office. I was sure she was going to announce my promotion to vice president, but I was wrong. I walked into my wife's new office and she and Todd hugged. They parted as soon as they saw me, and Todd left quickly. He just gave me a hug congratulating me on my promotion, Jenny said quickly. I accepted her explanation and kissed her on the cheek, expressing my congratulations. Chad, sit down, she pointed to the chair in front of her. I quickly took a seat and expected to be promoted. Instead, I heard, I wanted to tell you personally, before the memo goes out, that I'm appointing Todd Wankler as the new vice president of radio production. What the fuck? I screamed, jumping to my feet. Calm down and sit down so we can talk things over in peace, my wife would say in her soothing voice that she used with our two girls, Tiffany and Tina, when they were little. Fuck that, I spat out. Not only was I angry and hurt by what my wife was doing, but I was deeply suspicious of her relationship with Todd. I put my all out for this job, and Simon told me he was going to recommend me for it. Well, Simon's obviously not here, and I have to do what I think is right. Tiffany was still trying to use her soothing voice, but I could feel the tremor in it. Her eyes betrayed that she hadn't expected my reaction. How can you choose Todd over me? I demanded. Chad, please sit down, Jenny tried desperately to reassure me. I remained standing, looking at her. Realizing the situation wasn't going to improve, she hurriedly continued her explanation. Todd is just as good at production work as you are, and he's better at prioritizing than you are. Besides, I don't want anyone to think you're getting any special attention. Jenny, that's fucking horseshit. I almost shouted, then sarcastically offered. Is he as good at producing? Please tell me how many Mercury Awards he's won? Oh, that's right, none. I've gotten 4. And your comment about prioritizing is bullshit. You just like him because he looks good and always gets your commercials to the top of the production schedule. Chad, lower your voice and sit down, my wife demanded, but I was too pissed off to think straight. I chided my wife for her actions and I wasn't going to stop. And your comment about not wanting to appear to be the favorite is even more bullshit, I hissed at her. Everyone at work knows that Simon was going to nominate me to take his place. Now they're going to think Todd slept with you to get the job. How dare you, shouted Jenny, jumping to her feet. We stared at each other until Jenny sat back down and ended the discussion. I'm sorry you feel that way, Chad, but my decision stands. At that moment I realized that arguing with my wife was a waste of time. She had her back against the wall, figuratively speaking. I'd seen it many times in our married life. Once Jenny had made a decision, she rarely changed it, and if she did, it was only because there was irrefutable evidence that she was wrong. Even so, she never admitted she was wrong and pretended it had never been an issue. This time it was obvious that she wasn't going to change her mind, and I couldn't shake the suspicion that she was getting too close to Todd. We can discuss it at home tonight, she suggested at the conclusion of the meeting. No, this discussion is not over, I said through clenched teeth. I refuse to work for that asshole. You'll be working for Todd if you want to keep your job here, Jenny was starting to get angry. Well, that settles it then, I said as I walked out of her office. I'll clean my office. Look, Chad, I know you're upset, so I'm going to give you a few days to come to your senses and soothe your bruised ego. Take some time and calm down. When you've had a chance to think things over, you'll realize I'm right. Fuck you, Jenny. I'm not going to change my mind in a few days. I'm not going to change it in a few 100 years either. So I'll leave you and your boyfriend to mind your own business, I said as I walked out of her office and headed for my own. I think she was yelling that he wasn't her boyfriend, but I wasn't listening. I headed straight to my office, packed up my stuff and left. The people in the production department were stunned. I didn't say anything to anyone when I left. At home, I got a glass and made myself a strong rum and coke. Then I sat in my room, thinking about what my supposedly loving wife had done. Looking out the window, I realized 2 things. I would never work for Todd, and Jenny would never back down from her decision, especially now that I had defied her. I still loved my wife deeply, even though I was mad as hell at her now and wasn't sure of her loyalty. But I needed a new job, so I started putting together a resume. I only got as far as typing my name and address at the top of the page, but then I stopped. I was too excited to continue, and I knew I needed something to help me calm down. I pulled out my folders of radio station ads and started going through them one by one. Even though Jenny had no interest in owning a radio station, I never lost that desire. It was like a hobby for me. I tracked every radio station for sale in the markets I was interested in, Tennessee, Georgia, and Florida. And if a station caught my eye, I would take an interest in it and find out all the details. Sometimes, if the station was near a larger market, I would hire a radio engineer to see if the station could be moved closer. These searches led nowhere. Nevertheless, I kept looking. After 4 hours of going through old folders of stations for sale and 2 more shots of rum and coke, I remembered that I had recently received information on 3 stations that had just gone on sale. I pulled the 3 files out of the closet where I had left them 2 days ago. Ideally, I wanted to buy an FM station because out of all the people who listen to the radio, only 25% listen to AM stations. Of the 3 files, 2 of the stations were FM, and both were in Tennessee. The WTXY station in Memphis would have been a perfect fit. The station had an audience of over 1.2 million people. The price tag was $1.6 million, which wasn't bad considering its revenues. And the owner was willing to finance $1 million. I could have scraped together $600,000 by cashing out my 401k and draining our investment, but then I wouldn't have any operating capital. And of course, there was still a small problem: half of our investments belonged to Jenny. I spent half an hour going over all of our financials before shoving the WTXY folder into my desk drawer. WLEB was an FM station in Lebanon, Tennessee. Lebanon had a population of about 38,000, but the tower and transmitter were 18 miles east of Lebanon. I asked the broadcast engineer to see if the tower could be moved closer to Nashville or raised higher. The higher the FM antenna, the farther the signal travels. When IREA D his report, the answer was mostly negative. Oh, it could be done by getting the two stations to swap frequencies, which would be expensive, so that folder went in the drawer, too. The last station I had the engineer check was WZEP in Zephyrhills, Florida. This was an AM radio station on 1,420 kHz that broadcast at 1,000 watts during the day and 187 watts at night. The tower and transmitter were located 12 miles east of Zephyrhills. At present, their signal at full power barely reached the outskirts of the Tampa suburbs during the daytime with a very weak signal. At night, WEP's signal barely covered Zephyrhills. I wouldn't even consider this station were it not for its proximity to the Tampa/St. Petersburg area. The same engineer who did the WLEB search for me prepared the WZEP report. Surprisingly, the tower could be moved 18 miles southwest of Zephyrhills. There was another interesting detail in the report. If the station was moved at least 16 miles southwest, it would not have to reduce power at night. It would be able to broadcast all day long at 1,000 watts. Sorry to butt in again, but I couldn't help myself. I had just had my legs kicked out from under my supposedly loving wife at work, and I was floundering. In addition to being hurt and humiliated, I was struggling with simmering jealousy. I was desperately trying to suppress my anger and decide what to do next. As I started reading the WZEP report again, I heard the front door open and close. Jenny was home. I didn't want to face her. Over the years, I'd realized that Jenny was very hard-headed when she thought she was right. And since I'm somewhat hard-headed myself, our first year together was spent fighting epic battles. Our stubbornness coupled with limited finances and a cranky child pushed our marriage to a breaking point. I even moved out for a week once, but I couldn't stay away. I truly loved Jenny and couldn't bear the thought of not being able to be with her and my daughter. Since most of our early fights were over nothing, over time I learned to put up with them. And if I really felt that Jenny was wrong, I would gather irrefutable evidence before she could burrow in. But in this situation, only time could show Jenny that she was making a mistake. And there was no way I was going to work for that bastard for months or years until she hopefully realized how bad her decision had been. And even if Jenny realizes her mistake, there's a good chance she won't admit it. "Oh, you're here," Jenny said as she entered my room. "We need to talk about what happened at work today. Are you going to reverse your decision and make me vice president of radio production?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I won't do it because I made the right decision," Jenny snapped back. "And your reaction to my decision only confirmed how right I was. Then we have nothing to talk about. Why don't you call your boyfriend if you want to discuss something?" I said, turning to the folder in my hand again. "Stop being a spoiled little brat and come out to the living room so we can discuss this like adults. And stop calling him my boyfriend. That cheating shot you called out at work has already started rumors. Please close the door when you leave," I said without emotion, though inside I was seething with anger and resentment. Jenny slammed the door shut, walking out of my office. It was cold in the house that night and I slept in one of the girls' old rooms. My wife was up early and out the door. I knew what was waiting for me. Jenny would keep me in a deep freeze until I gave in. But this time it wouldn't work. I knew the VP position would never be mine, and I wasn't going to hold my breath waiting for an apology when my wife realized her mistake. During our 20 years of marriage, I had backslid many times. It was unpleasant at times, but I had learned to live with it. But this issue was at the very core of who I was, and I didn't want to give in for anything. So, after taking a shower and making myself a cup of coffee, I decided to look deeper into WZEP. The asking price for the station was $225,000, which in my opinion was too much for what they were selling. The income generated was not enough to pay the expenses. And according to an appraisal done 4 years ago, the land and building were only worth about $100,000. I reread the engineer's report on moving the station and was now definitely interested. So, I called the broker and got 2 pieces of information that really excited me. The first piece of information was that Bob Stammer, the station's owner, is now in a nursing home and his wife, Beth, is desperate to sell the station. She lowered the price to $125,000. The broker then informed me that Mr. Stammer had already obtained a building permit from the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, to move the tower 18 miles southwest of its current location. Not only that, but Mr. Stammer had posted a $1,000 bond for the 6 acres of land where he intended to move the station. The value of the vacant land was $18,000, and the bond was part of the sale of the station. I arranged to meet with my broker, Jack Burrows, the day after tomorrow. Before heading south, I needed to take care of my finances. The first thing I did was open an account in my name only and instructed the broker to sell half of our investment portfolio. Then I transferred half of our checking and savings account to my new personal account. When the dust settled, my new account had $187,000 in it. Jenny and I shared a credit card, and we both had corporate credit cards. I decided not to do anything with the joint credit card since I wouldn't use it, ordering a new one when I opened the new account. My corporate card I would return to the station. I know many would urge me to cancel the joint credit card, but I doubted Jenny would max it out. She had her reputation to think about, and if she was sued for not paying her bills, it would definitely hurt her. Besides, the limit on the card was $3,000. We rarely used a single credit card, preferring to use debit cards instead. After wrapping up what I could in Atlanta, I packed my bag and left Jenny a note. The note simply informed her that I'd be gone for a few days, but didn't say where I was going. I know I was being a jerk, but I didn't care. I also asked her to say hi to her boyfriend for me. I knew she would be furious, but again, I didn't care. Finally, I hit the road. I got stuck in traffic on the way out of Atlanta, so the trip took an extra hour, which didn't upset me one bit. I was finally following my dream. After settling into my motel room, I drove past the WZEP. The building looked like it had been held together with chewing gum and duct tape. The tower was in desperate need of a paint job, and one of the cables was dangling idly. I still hadn't decided whether to move the existing tower to a new location or buy a new one. I was now leaning towards buying a new tower. I was tempted to look inside the station, but decided against it. I would see it all tomorrow. Instead, I headed toward the 6 acres of land. Jack had given me directions, and the lot was easy to find since it still had the realtor's sign hanging on it. Using the number on the sign, I called the broker. Her name was Sally Wilson, and she was delighted when I asked her to draw up a sales contract. I explained that I would be willing to close on the sale of the land if I could negotiate the purchase of the WZEP. The next day Jack showed me around the station. It turned out to be just as I expected. Most of the equipment was ancient, and the automation program was a joke. The 2 transmitters were tube, and judging from the logs, they were constantly being repaired. The console in the main studio, however, was fairly new. It was only 5 or 6 years old, and appeared to be in good condition. The microphones were good, too. A walk around the tower convinced me that moving it would be a mistake. There was too much rust on it, and half the wires looked like they needed to be replaced. I decided to buy a brand new, freestanding tower along with a new solid-state transmitter for about $29,000. I ended up having to dismantle the old tower and sell it for scrap. Leaving Jack at the station, I told him I would call him tomorrow and let him know my answer. I drove into town and started looking in the local stores. Since the station's format was religious, I wasn't surprised when only a few people admitted to listening to it. When I asked what format the station should use, opinions were evenly divided: talk radio and oldies. The demographics told me there was a market for either format. After dinner, I went back to my room to analyze my financial situation once again. But I was interrupted by my cell phone signal. I was stunned to see that it was Jenny. I was about to send the phone to voicemail, but decided to tell her that I wasn't planning to go back to work because I was following my dream of owning a radio station. After I said hello, Jenny took over for me. "Have you stopped being annoyed yet? So now I have a claim?" I replied, feeling the anger building up. "I thought I was being childish. I still can't believe you gave my job to your boyfriend." "Damn it, Chad, for the last time, stop calling Todd my boyfriend," Jenny flared up, but immediately calmed down. "Look, Chad, I think I picked the best person for the job, even though it hurt me to do it." I said nothing, and an awkward silence followed before she started again. "I truly believe Todd is the best person for the position. Every time I brought work to your department, you didn't care that my spots were for a $300,000 campaign that needed to be done. I had to stand in line for some paltry $3,000 sponsor," Jenny said with venom. "Todd always hooked me up and got my videos right away. And I think he's as good a judge of production as you are." Wow! What a revelation how little my wife thinks of me. It's just so damn cool. I struggled to contain my fervor. It was so like Jenny. When she was convinced, she was right, full steam ahead, and to hell with the torpedoes. She must have caught the tone in my voice. "Chad, I don't want to fight. I love you and I want you to come home. We need to talk this out and put it behind us." I wanted to lash out at her, but I was afraid I would say something that I couldn't take back later. So instead I decided to speak candidly about the situation at WJTR. "Jen, I love you with all my heart, but what you did to me at the station was just cruel and humiliating, not to mention completely wrong. I will never work for Todd, ever. Chad, I can't cover for you anymore." Jenny sounded sad in her voice. "People are already asking questions about where you are. And Todd is demanding that you go back to work or be fired. And he has every right to demand that you do your job or be fired. If you are not back at work by Monday, I will be forced to fire you. Do whatever you need to do," I growled and ended the call. Jenny tried to call back, but I transferred the call to voicemail and then turned the phone off. Before my conversation with my wife, I was 95% sure the deal would go through. Now I was totally okay with it. The next day I told Jack to offer $100,000. I was willing to pay full price, so I called the real estate broker and told her to prepare the deeds to the land. The next day Beth offered $115,000 and I accepted. After that, I placed an order for a new tower and transmitter. I also purchased an automation program for $4,000. I met with the surveyor at the site and asked him to map out the best place to put the house that would also house the radio station. I also asked him to mark the location of the tower on the plan. I arranged for a well to be dug and electricity to be run to it. The last thing I did that day was to call John Mickelson. He and Helen had retired and moved to Newport Richey, which was just under an hour away. I wanted him to help me build a house on the property. He was thrilled, saying he was completely bored in retirement. He also said that after I drew the plans, he would take care of getting all the permits. With all the expenses that had accumulated, I realized that I would have to tap into my 401k. At this point, its market value was about $350,000. This meant that I would have to go back to Atlanta to sign the papers. I also decided to rent a trailer and move it to the lot to be my temporary home. When I got to Atlanta, I would pick up as much stuff as I felt I would need for the next few months. I especially needed my CD collection, mostly old CDs. I decided to change the format of the radio station to an oldies station playing music from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. If that doesn't work, I'll switch to a talk format. As it turned out, I was no longer able to fly to Atlanta on Tuesday of the following week. One of the reasons for the delay was that I wanted to meet with John first. We spent most of the week looking at the lot, meeting with the house designer, visiting the building department, and pricing materials. There was a pleasant surprise waiting for me in the building department. Bob Stammer had already applied for a building permit for the tower and it had been approved. All I need to do is ask Beth to transfer the permit to me. I also learned that I don't need a contractor to build the house, I can apply for the permit as an owner-builder. I gave John the plans for the site where the tower would stand so he could start laying out the forms to pour the concrete. My meeting with Jack and Beth went smoothly and we signed the purchase agreement. Jack called Ray Thomas, the FCC attorney, and faxed the contract to him. I talked to Ray briefly and he said it could take the FCC 180 days to approve the sale, but in his experience it takes much less time. In any case, he said that if the owner and I came to an agreement, I could start operating the station immediately. Mrs. Stammer agreed that I could start running the station in 2 weeks if I explained to the church and the sponsors what was going on. We also agreed that I could keep all the income from existing sponsors if I took over the station's expenses. From the train station, I went to Sally Wilson's office to sign the land contract. I spent the rest of the week visiting businesses in Zephyrhills and surrounding towns, interspersed with John and I meeting with subcontractors. I informed all the current sponsors of the program change to the old songs. The churches were a little upset by this change, but were grateful for the warning. I made arrangements with 2 churches to allow them to have Sunday morning services. At each business I explained what I was doing and many were interested. We'll have to wait until I get to my shift to see if those interested turn into sponsors. Monday night I went to bed early, as I needed to get up before dawn to make it to Atlanta between the morning and evening rush hours. I got back to Atlanta around 11 a.m. and the first thing I did was go to the house. I knew I didn't have much room at Zephyrhills, so I only took 4 changes of clothes, 2 twin beds, springs and frames, a chair, a small desk and chair, a desktop computer, and 2,000 CDs. All the other things I left there, as I didn't want Jenny to get the impression that I was abandoning her. I arrived at WJTR at about 2 p.m. and got through security without any problems since I was still technically employed there. I went straight to HR and explained what I was doing. They were not surprised, and Martha Brown, the HR director, told me that she expected me to come to her earlier once Todd's promotion memo got on her desk. I asked Martha what she had heard about any relationship between Jenny and Todd. She admitted that there were rumors, but she had never seen anything inappropriate. After a few minutes of awkwardness, Martha asked me if I was resigning. I explained that Jenny had told me that if I didn't return to work by Monday, I would be fired. Since it was Tuesday, I agreed to the resignation. I gave Martha the account numbers where my last paychecks were to be deposited and my new SIPIRA numbers so she could transfer my 401k. Martha kissed me on the cheek and told me not to be a stranger. I stopped by the production office to say goodbye and was mobbed. Everyone wanted to know when I was going back to work. I think some of them were completely stunned when I told them I had been laid off. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing because I wanted to tell my wife first. Todd stayed in his office like the cowardly little bitch I knew he was. As I walked out of the production department, I found Jenny standing in the hallway waiting for me. "Were you just going to sneak in and sneak out without noticing me?" she demanded. "No," I replied. "I was just on my way to your office." "Okay, let's go to put all this behind us." Jenny turned and headed for the elevator without letting me say a word. So I just followed her. Jenny's new office had a spectacular view of Atlanta. Settling into a chair, she began, "I'm glad you've decided to come back to work. Todd told me he has some ideas on how he wants to reorganize the production department. He can't wait to meet with you to discuss your new responsibilities. I've already spoken to Mr. Hammett, and he's agreed to a substantial increase in your salary. You won't make as much as Todd, but you'll keep your old position." I sighed because I knew this was going to be uncomfortable. "I think it's really fancy that you and Todd have decided my future, but I'm going to take a hard pass. I'm not coming back. You told me I had to be back by Monday or I'd be fired. I took you at your word. I'm here to give HR information on where to send my last check, transfer my 401k, and say goodbye to the people in production." Jenny just sat there, staring at me. I couldn't tell if she was angry or sad or both. Finally, she shook her head. "Todd said you'd probably do it, but it's not what I wanted. Still, maybe it's for the best. I can see that your ego can't get over the fact that your wife is your boss. I think getting a job at another station would be better anyway. Seriously, do you think I'm jealous of your promotion?" I was amazed at Jenny's train of thought. "You are sorely mistaken if you think that. I'm very happy about your promotion. I wouldn't have wanted the job for anything. It's too political for me. You'll have to play corporate politics like never before." "No, I'm not jealous of your promotion at all. I'm jealous that you put Todd above me because he's a real asshole. All he wants to do is get into the panties of any woman he can. Someday you'll find out what a snake he is, but I don't expect you to ever admit it. I just hope your decision doesn't come back to bite you in the ass. I have no doubts about my decision, she said firmly. And I don't believe the lies that are being spread about Todd. So, if you're not going to come back here, have you found another job at another station? You remember you can't work at any other radio station in Atlanta for 6 months. No, I'm not looking for another job, I said with a smile. I've decided to buy a radio station. Jenny looked at me in disbelief. I thought we decided that buying a radio station was a bad idea. No, you thought it was a bad idea. I never gave up on the idea of owning my own station one day. So, I'm buying WZEP in Zephyrhills, Florida. It's a 1000 watt AM station. You bought a little 1000 watt AM station in the middle of nowhere, in Florida? Contempt sounded in her voice. Tell me that signal at least gets to a larger market. Not currently, I replied, annoyed at her attitude. In fact, the power is only 1000 watts during the day. At night, it drops to 187 watts. But I have a plan to change that. And how will this affect our marriage? Jenny shifted gears with conc. Earn in her voice. You'll be in the backwoods of Florida, and I'll be here in Atlanta. Well, you could come with me and help me rebuild the station, I said with a smile, knowing there was no way in hell she would agree to that. I don't care what you say about your ego not being hurt by my promotion. Jenny was already angry and glaring at me. Todd told me you couldn't handle my promotion. I think buying that stupid little radio station is an attempt to convince everyone that you could be the boss. Oh, for God's sake, I've had enough, I said, rising. I don't care what you believe. I bought the station, and I have plans for it. I was sure you'd never join me in Florida, but I hoped you'd be happy for me. I see I was wrong. I was about to leave, but stopped. Oh, you should know, I took half the money out of our checking, savings and investment accounts. I also arranged to transfer my 401k into my newest IRA. In addition, I took several pieces of furniture and some of my belongings out of the house. So it's over, Jenny said, rising to her feet, her face beginning to pale. Our marriage is over? I didn't say or imply that, I puzzled, perplexed at how my wife had gone from rebuking me for buying a tiny 1000 watt AM radio station in nowhere, Florida, to me wanting a divorce. How are we going to keep our marriage alive if you're in Florida and I'm in Georgia? A lot of couples get married while working in different places, I explained. I can come down for long weekends and you can come visit me. Hell, military couples have a much harder time. They're separated for months at a time. It's a bullshit plan, Chad, Jenny snapped back. If you're going to Florida, then we don't have a marriage. It's entirely up to you, Jenny. If you want a divorce, file the papers. I'm sure Todd will comfort you when I'm gone. Right now, my goal is to turn the radio station into something special. Jenny's face went from pale to bright red. She was absolutely furious. I could always tell when my wife was on edge. The vein in her forehead was starting to throb. Fuck you and your shitty station, she shouted. Todd was right about you. I can see that you want to leave me. And when I'm gone, you can spend all your time on that loser radio station. If that's what you want to do, fine. But I expect half the house expenses every month. Jenny had pushed the wrong button, and now I was beyond angry. I'm not going to argue with you anymore. I've made my decision and I don't care what you think. If you think we don't have a marriage, go ahead and file for divorce. So you want a divorce after all? Jenny was breathing hard, and I could see the fear in her eyes. The way you're treating me, I said before I could stop myself, maybe it's for the best. Ever since you were made executive vice president, all you've done is disrespect and humiliate me. We've talked many times about the possibility of us moving up when our bosses retire. And when we talked about the possibility of me becoming VP of operations, you always said I deserved it. But when you got the chance to do it, you gave the job to Todd, so screw you and the horse you rode in on. Right now, I don't give a damn what you want to do with our marriage. I'm sure Todd will warm your bed if you get lonely." Jenny burst into tears and ran out of the office. I went back over and over again to the idea of looking for her and trying to straighten things out. But I was so annoyed that I said to myself screw it and left. I didn't deserve the kind of disrespect my wife heaped on me, and I was tired of giving in to her all the time. This time she went too far. The drive back to Zephyrhills seemed like an eternity, but it took a little over 6 hours. I kept coming back to our argument, and it was clear to me that Jenny had backed herself into a corner. And I'm sure Todd had a hand in my marital problems. Usually, if we had an argument, Jenny would just hold her ground and wait for me to give in. But with Todd here, I didn't know if Jenny cared. But I was sure that nowhere in her mind was it in her mind that if we were going to fix things, she would have to apologize to me first. I was haunted by the thought that perhaps the gulf between us was too great to bridge. I didn't sleep well that night, but I was up at the crack of dawn. I had so much to do, and that was good because it kept my mind off the marriage problems. There was only one part-time employee at the station, Amanda Tabor, and that was good because it was all I could afford. There were 3 volunteers, but only one offered to stay, Randy Stamos. Amanda was married and had 2 children. She needed the extra money so she and her husband could make ends meet. She also explained that sometimes she had to take one or the other child with her if her mother or mother-in-law couldn't babysit. I was fine with them not being in the main studio, production room, and transmission room. Once the automation system was in place, I showed Randy how to load the old songs into the program. I then sent Amanda out to distribute flyers to all the businesses and other places where she thought people might see that we were changing the format. I also decided to attend a city council meeting in Zephyrhills and one in each of the surrounding towns, introduce ourselves and offer to help in any way we could. I didn't think my family problems could get any worse, but I was wrong. 2 days after the confrontation with Jenny, I got a call from my daughters. The first to call was Tina, our youngest. She had a temper just like her mother. And she lashed out at me right from the door. "Dad, why the hell did you leave Mom?" She snapped back. "And why do you want a divorce?" I sighed to myself. "First of all, Tina, it's none of your business. Second, I don't want a divorce and I didn't leave your mother." "Bullshit, Dad," my daughter blurted out. "Mom says you quit your job because she wouldn't give you a raise. And then you told her to file for divorce." "Tina, I'm only going to say this to you once, stay out of our marriage." I was annoyed with both Jenny and Tina. Even if Jenny had completely twisted the story in her favor, which I didn't doubt, Tina was old enough to know that it was better for her to stay out of her mother's and father's squabbles. "Mom's right, you're acting like a spoiled brat," Tina replied. "Okay, that's enough. Tina, I love you very much, but until you apologize, it's over between us. And you can tell your mother the same thing," and then I hung up. About a half hour later, Tiffany called. She was acting more calm, but was deeply upset that I had apparently abandoned her mother. I was already in a bad mood, and I wasn't about to put up with any more crap from my kids. "Daddy, is it true you live in Florida now?" began Tiffany. "I live in Florida," I admitted, but before I could say anything Tiffany interrupted me. "So it's true, you're divorcing your mom." "Tiffany, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told Tina. It's none of your fucking business, so stay out of it." Tiffany hung up the phone. Sitting there staring at my phone, I felt incredibly lonely. I was angry that Todd seemed to have messed with my wife's head and who knows who else. Besides the fact that I was now completely disconnected from my family, I suddenly realized that I had put all my eggs in one basket. If the radio station doesn't survive, I'll find myself between a hammer and an anvil. Finding a job after leaving WJTR was one thing, but trying to get a job as a failed radio station owner would be much more difficult. Fortunately, there was so much to do that I didn't have time to brood or feel sorry for myself. The transmitter arrived 2 weeks after I took over the station, but I didn't set it up. I would wait until we moved to the new place. John had already submitted plans for the new house, and we were waiting for a building permit. In the meantime, I cleared the lot where the house was to stand and brought in fill material. We dug the foundation for the house, and I was pleased that the permit was issued in 4 days. For weeks after that, the tower was brought in and the installation crew showed up another 3 days later. It cost me another $7,000 to install the tower, but the new tower could withstand winds up to 140 miles per hour. On July 1st, I changed the station format to oldies. I took over the station in the middle of the off-season, probably the worst time to start a business in South Florida. However, within an hour, people started calling us and thanking us for our new sound. In addition, within the first week, 3 companies came through the door and wanted to sponsor us. I was very encouraged. 3 months later, we moved the radio station to a new location. John, myself, and 3 part-time workers finished building a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house, dividing it roughly down the middle. I lived on one side with 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, kitchen, and living room. On the other side, 2 bedrooms were set aside for the main studio and production room. By the side door was a small room that served as the lobby. Further down the short hallway was the family room, which now served as a conference/rec room. I sectioned off the back of the garage to create a small room to house the new transmitter. To cool this room from the Florida heat, I installed a window air conditioner. A 24 kilowatts backup generator was also installed to power the entire house, radio station, and transmitter. When we turned on the new solid-state transmitter broadcasting from our new tower, I was pleased to see that we were covering about a third of Tampa with a strong signal. But the farther west we traveled, the signal quickly diminished. While our signal didn't reach all of Tampa, I was thrilled at how much it covered. And with our penetration into Tampa, our revenues increased dramatically. Before I changed formats, the station was losing about $4,000 a month. After the format change, we were break-even in 2 months and profitable in 4. However, I continued to pay out more money than I was receiving to upgrade the equipment. So even though the station was making a profit, I was still emptying my 401k. To date, I had withdrawn $190,000 from my retirement fund. This was bad, as I had to pay a 10% penalty to the IRS, as well as pay the capital gains added to my tax return. Once we started making a profit, the outflow from my retirement fund slowed down. Eventually, I started contributing money to my SAP IRA. Even though the station was bringing in money, I was only getting 35% of my salary at WJTR. And if I had stayed and accepted the promotion, the difference would have been even worse. I was getting less than 25% of the paycheck I would have gotten in Atlanta. Nevertheless, the pay cut didn't bother me. I was immensely proud and happy that I had taken a failing station and made it profitable. However, this happiness was greatly overshadowed by the fact that Jenny was not there to share it with me. In all this time, I have not heard a word from my wife. And after calls from my daughters, I heard nothing from either of them. I didn't dwell on my separated family as I had more things to do in a day than I had time to do them. However, some days I wondered if I would ever hear from my wife and daughters again. At least a dozen times each week I was tempted to pick up the phone and call my wife. But immediately the memories of utter disrespect and humiliation came flooding back. And visions of Todd and my wife kept me from making that call. Then one day I finally heard from my wife. It came in the form of a separation agreement. I was so angry that I signed it immediately. I sent it back with a note that there would be no reconciliation unless she apologized first. I never heard from my wife again, but my 2 daughters called me again to beg me to put my ego aside and reconcile with their mother. This time I was polite but adamant in demanding an apology from Jenny. And I told Tina again that I expected an apology from her as well. She hung up on me. Months went by and I heard nothing from my wife or my 2 daughters. I drew my line in the sand and decided my family had written me off. Then suddenly, out of the blue, Tiffany called. Her voice was so quiet, I didn't realize who was calling at first until I heard it. "Daddy?" When I asked her to speak up, she burst into tears. "I'm so sorry, Daddy. I'm so sorry. Can you forgive me?" "Tiffany, honey, there's nothing to forgive," I said to my sobbing daughter. "You were just protecting your mother. You can't know how humiliated and disrespected I felt by your mother's act. And your sister immediately sided with your mother and disrespected me even more. So I'm not talking to them until they apologize. But that doesn't mean I don't love them, because I do, and I was very lonely without you all. Thanks, Daddy, Tiffany said between sobs. I wish I had never believed Mom and Tina without hearing your side of the story. It's okay, sweetie, I said, trying to reassure my daughter. By the way, how are your mom and sister doing? Tina called me a few times, but all she wanted to do was sling mud at you, so I finally told her that if that's all she wanted to talk about, then have her stop calling me. I saw her a few times on campus, but we haven't spoken in 3 months. I talked to a few of her friends and they said she has become very withdrawn. I see my mom once every 2 weeks or so when I come home to do laundry. I'm only there for a few hours, but she seems out of sorts and I don't know if she's mad at me or not. One time when I was home, she went on a date with some guy named Todd. But I don't know if she had a good time or not because I wasn't there before she got home. This news hurt me deeply, and even though I knew I shouldn't let it bother me, it did. Since I signed the divorce settlement, I'd had a few dates. The women have been nice, but there was no spark, so nothing has worked out. Also, just recently, my workload has started to ease up a bit and I've had time to think about dating. Do you think you and Mom will ever get back together? Asked Tiffany finally. That's entirely up to your mom, I said sadly. I can't and won't do anything until I get an apology from her. But let's talk about something else. How are your classes going? I changed my major. Tiffany's voice sounded excited and more cheerful now. What did you switch to? Link. Really? Any idea what you want to do after graduation? I want to pursue a career in broadcasting. Tiffany's voice now sounded very excited. It's hard to make a living, I advised cautiously. What are you interested in? Radio, television, cable, print media, the internet? Right now I'm volunteering at the college radio station and it's a lot of fun. I'm also taking courses in television, and that's really cool. I have my own radio show. It's a sports show where I talk about all the college teams every week and interview the athletes. That's terrific. Tell me, what do you think about spending this summer with me at the station? I asked. I thought you'd never ask, Tiffany laughed. But I can only stay for a week or two because I need to make money for next year. I can pay you, I offered. It'll be at least as much as you'd earn at a minimum wage job, and you'll get great experience for your courses. Oh God, I'd love to do that, Tiffany said excitedly, but then added in a more subdued tone. But I'd have to tell my mom so she doesn't think I'm abandoning her. And if she resents it, I'll have to back out and take my old job at the ice cream parlor. Understood, and I agree. Talking to my daughter really lifted my spirits, and we started calling each other every week. But what happened 2 weeks later sent me into orbit and then into a pit of frustration. I got a call from a radio station broker informing me that there were 2 FM transmitters going on the market in the Tampa area. Basically, a transmitter is a 250-watt FM station that rebroadcasts the signal of an already licensed radio station to increase its coverage area. To be licensed as a translator, the station's signal must overlap with the translator's signal. And our signal overlapped with the signals of both broadcasters, so I applied for both. As it turned out, there were no stations that needed or overlapped with the northern translator's signal. However, 3 stations, including WZEP, were interested in the southern one. I offered a price of $30,000 for the north translator and $75,000 for the south translator, which was $25,000 more than the asking price. But another station offered $80,000 for the southern translator. I was a little disappointed to concede the southern translator, but the broker had already told me that he had a verbal agreement for the northern one. In fact, he was just doing the paperwork when the owners of the northern interpreter changed their minds. After hearing what they had been offered for the southern interpreter, they now wanted $80,000. I wasn't about to give in to their entreaties, so I told the broker, thanks, but no thanks. I was angry and bitterly disappointed. I hate it when people don't keep their word. Even though I didn't manage to get either of the 2 translators, I didn't have time to be upset for long. I had so many things I had to do. In addition to running the station, I hosted a morning show that had a little bit of everything along with old songs. When the show was over, I would do paperwork and then head out to find new sponsors. Although I wasn't making the kind of money that I did in Atlanta, I was very proud of the fact that the station retained 87% of our sponsors. When we moved the station, the income continued to grow. But I was still only making about 50% of what I was making in Atlanta. But owning a station had another advantage: trade. I traded seats for goods and services. The car I drove was leased from a local car dealer, but my monthly payments were covered by his on-air commercials. If you factor in trade, I was earning about 65% of my Atlanta paycheck. When May came around, two wonderful things happened. The first was the arrival of Tiffany. But just who she brought with her was the icing on the cake. She talked Tina into coming with her. When Tina got out of the car, I walked out of the station. She hesitated before I opened my arms wide. Tina rushed forward and fell into my arms, crying and apologizing. The girls told me that Jenny had talked them into coming with me for the summer. I got them both involved. I gave both girls a morning show that turned out to be a hit. Who knew the two of them could be so funny? 3 days a week I took them out and let them experience what attracting sponsors was all about. And it turned out they were pretty good at it. The two of them convinced 11 companies to become sponsors. The second major event that happened in May was the breakdown of the deal for the Southern translator. The FCC decided that the company that outbid me couldn't get the translator because it would give them more than 50% of the audience in St. Petersburg, which is a violation of FCC rules. I made inquiries about another company that was bidding for a Southern interpreter and they had the same situation, but in the Tampa market. They must have realized this because they didn't make a bid and I offered a price of $30,000. The company offered $50,000 and we agreed on $40,000. The next week I got another call from the broker. The Northern interpreter had not sold and the owner was wondering if I was interested in buying it at the original price. I offered $25,000, explaining that I had just purchased the Southern interpreter. They accepted the offer. I will now have a high-quality FM signal over all of Tampa and half of St. Petersburg. I looked around at the two interpreters before submitting my first prop. Oh soul. One of the translators was located in the corner of the law firm's parking lot. The previous owner paid monthly rent to the law firm, and they had their own electric meter. Instead of paying rent, after the deal was finalized, I negotiated a swap with the law firm rent for advertising. I also convinced them to let me put a backup generator next to the transmitter and a 100-gallon propane tank in the ground. The second transmitter was on the roof of the condominium. I couldn't bargain anything from them for rent, but I did find out that they had a backup generator for the entire building. That made me happy. With those two purchases, I moved into a bigger arena. The Tampa and St. Petersburg market was the 17th largest in the country. Even though each translator had a different frequency, people found us quickly. In the following quarterly Arbitron ratings, we became the 12th most popular station in Tampa. Since our audience was much larger than before, our revenues increased substantially. However, I took care of the sponsors who had been with me when it was just an AM station. I kept the same rates for them. Soon I was making more money than I had ever made in Atlanta. And yet I was lonely. But I didn't have time to think about that, because it was hurricane season. From what I've been told, Florida has been lucky the last few hurricane seasons. All of the major storms haven't hit the state. But this year we weren't just hit, we were hit twice, with the eye of the hurricane passing right over us both times. The first storm hit the east coast of Florida as a Category 3 storm, but when it passed our neighborhood it was only a Category 1 storm. I was worried about the house, the tower, and the translators. But everything came through without a problem. 6 weeks later, another hurricane passed over the Florida Keys and headed almost to the Yucatan before changing direction and beginning to move steadily toward the west coast of Florida. It was named Hurricane Karen and was initially thought to be headed south of St. Petersburg. But, as with all hurricanes, its path kept changing. When it looked like the hurricane was targeting Tampa, a mass exodus began from the city. Roads were clogged with cars heading north, south, and east. The I-75 highway was jammed and the southbound lane north of Tampa turned into the northbound lane. There were still 2 more days before the hurricane landed, and just after Tampa, the I-75 freeway could only be traveled north. Some people traveled south, but word quickly spread that all hotel and motel rooms were booked right down to the Keys. Although the eastbound highways were not high-traffic roads, they were soon jammed with cars trying to escape the Category 5 hurricane. The day before landfall, Karen's trajectory shifted further north and it looked like she was heading straight for Newport Richey. As soon as I saw this, I called John and Helen and told them to come to our station. When I built the house, I went well beyond the building requirements. I had extra strapping on the roof rafters, a metal roof, and over the wood framing I had hardy board, which is cement fiber siding. I had hurricane-proof windows, and of course a generator with a 500-gallon propane tank. I built the house with hurricanes in mind, but Hurricane Karen was a Category 5, and with a storm that big, all bets were off. The usual hour drive from John and Helen's house to the station took 4. And about 6 hours after John and Helen arrived, the regular electricity went out. This was not surprising, as the wind was blowing at 60 to 70 miles per hour with gusts up to 90. Fortunately, the generator started up exactly as it was supposed to. Our landline and cell phone were still working, so Tiffany and Tina kept in touch with the local and county police. Any news we received was immediately broadcast. I was very concerned about the approaching storm, but we did everything we could to prepare. We had plenty of food and water. And when the generator was installed, I was told that my 500-gallon tank would last at least a week. When Tina's cell phone rang, it surprised us. We were using the landline to contact law enforcement. Very quickly I realized it was Jenny calling her daughter. I figured she was calling to make sure her daughters were safe. But that's not why she was calling. "No, Mom," I heard Tina say. "Turn around and head back to Atlanta. It's too dangerous to try to get here. Please just turn around because the winds are already over 75 miles per hour." "Mom? Mom? Mom?" I lost her. "She's not trying to come here, is she?" I asked Tina. "I don't know," Tina said, trying to call her mother back, but the message went to voicemail. Giving up trying to call her mother, Tina added, "My mom said she's gotten to the point where she can't continue on I-75, so she's going to take the Florida Turnpike and then turn onto it, using alternate roads. I'm sure she'll see how strong the wind is and turn back," Tiffany offered uncertainly. The fact that Jenny might be riding into the impending storm made my anxiety even worse. Yes, we were estranged, but I still loved her. But now I could only hope she'd heeded her daughter's advice and turned back. After another hour, I decided that the girls and I would break into the music more often to reassure, advise, and give whatever information we could to our listeners who were weathering an extremely dangerous storm. After a few hours of this kind of work, we took turns starting to take breaks. I was on my second break when I thought I heard something slamming against the house. Thinking it might be a fallen tree with branches hitting the house, I grabbed my chainsaw and headed for the front door. But it wasn't a fallen tree. I found Jenny lying on the steps. I quickly dropped the saw and reached her through the wind. There was a 4-inch gash along the right side of her face, blood dripping down the top of her blouse. There were numerous smaller cuts on the rest of her face, arms, and legs. As I lifted her into my arms, a brutal wind blew. She opened one eye, the other was swollen shut, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Then that eye closed again. Back in the house, John closed the door and called out to Helen. The girls came running from the studio and gasped at the sight of their mother. I carried her into my bedroom and laid her gently on the bed. A few seconds later Helen came in with the first aid kit and I went to the bathroom to get a small basin of warm water and soap. The girls stood guard over their mother until I escorted them out of the room so we could treat the wounds. While I washed her face, hands, and feet, Helen applied band-aids or dabbed small cuts with Neosporin. On the larger wound, I used butterfly bandages to tighten the skin and minimize the scar. After the hurricane passed, I took Jenny to the first 24-hour clinic open to get stitches. The last thing I did was put a cold compress on her eye. I sat with Jenny while the storm raged outside the window. She looked so fragile lying on my bed. Jenny had definitely lost weight. Despite everything that had happened between us, I still loved her deeply and wanted to hold her close to me. I finally dozed off, but woke up in the middle of the night when everything around me suddenly went quiet. I went out and found Tiffany still in the control room, staring at the ceiling. "What's going on, Daddy?" she asked with fear in her voice. "A minute ago he sounded like a jet engine. Now he's deadly." I knew at once what was the matter. The eye of the hurricane is passing over us right now. Let's go see what happened outside. I took a large flashlight and cautiously opened the front door. It was deathly cold, and the air was hot and clammy. As I walked down the stairs, I could see the stars overhead. But I knew we didn't have much time, and I wanted to see how the house and tower were doing. What I discovered pleased me. Although half a dozen trees were fallen, none of them had done any damage. Taking a quick walk around the house, I saw nothing of concern. Then I headed for the tower, checked the meter at its base, it showed the correct amperage. I ran my flashlight up and down the tower structure, but saw no damage. But we were only halfway through the storm. I took Tiffany's hand and led her back into the house. I explained that once the back of the eye passed, the storm would start raging again at full force. A few minutes after we got back to the house, the wind was howling again at top speed. I sent Tiffany to bed and stayed in the studio for another hour, assuring listeners that the eye had passed and the wind would begin to subside. Finally, I bowed out, wishing our listeners good luck and saying that they would be in our prayers. I retired to my bedroom, where I threw my blanket and pillow on the floor next to my bed. I wrapped myself in the blanket and dozed off. It seemed like only a few minutes had passed when I heard John stirring, and soon I could smell coffee brewing. I got up and saw that Jenny was still asleep, so I slipped outside for a cup of caffeine. I needed it. Just then I realized that the wind wasn't blowing. The storm had subsided and I walked out the front door. More fallen trees greeted me, but other than one lying across the driveway, I didn't see any obvious damage. A quick walk around the house revealed no damage either, and the tower was standing as if nothing had happened. A quick check of the base meter showed that the amperage was normal. After greeting John and grabbing a cup of coffee, I headed for the bedroom. I was pleasantly surprised to find Jenny awake. She was looking at me with trepidation. "I'm so sorry, Chad," she said immediately. "You were right about everything. Everything you said about Todd was right, except that he turned out to be worse than you thought. It took me too long to realize he was a snake in the grass. I can't believe I even went out with him in the first place. That's when I realized he was a total creep. He was only interested in getting in my pants and trashing you. What I never fully realized was that he'd been pushing me around since the first day he became VP of operations. And even when I realized you were right about how he was handling his job, my pride wouldn't let me admit it. But in the end I had to face it and sent Mr. Hammett a memo saying that I was firing Todd. I was immediately called into his office. That's when I first realized what Todd was doing. For every mistake Todd made, he blamed me or someone else. He wrote notes that he supposedly sent to me, but I never received them. Mr. Hammett was less than pleasant in the meeting, blaming me for my failure as executive vice president. When I tried to explain, he got angry and said he had no respect for people who try to blame others for their failures. "I can't believe Todd was able to pull the wool over Mr. Hammett's eyes," I offered. "I always thought Charles was a good judge of character. That he couldn't see through Todd's bullshit really surprises me." Anyway, Jenny continued, "He told me that he was removing me as EVP immediately and handing the job over to Todd. He also said that I won't be returning to my old position because he no longer trusts me. If I want to, I can stay as a salesperson." "What did you say, Charles?" I asked with a smile, knowing my wife's temper. "You'd be proud of me," Jenny returned my smile. "I told him that if he believed Todd's bullshit, he deserved it. And he could shove his sales job up his ass." "What did Charles say to that?" "He said he was sorry I felt that way. But I replied that he wasn't really sorry, but would be when he realized what a sneak Todd had been. Then I got up, cleaned up my office and went home. I wanted to call you so badly, but I was afraid you'd hang up on me." Then when I saw Hurricane Karen coming at you, I had to be with you and the girls." We sat in silence, looking at each other. Then Jenny asked, "Do you think you can forgive me for my stupidity?" "Absolutely," I replied immediately, leaning in and kissing her. Jenny explained that she was about a mile from the station when a tree fell on the road. She tried to stop, but still hit the tree at about 30 miles per hour. For some reason the airbag did not deploy and Jenny hit her head on the steering wheel. Jenny doesn't remember how she got to the station after the accident. But she does remember that the wind knocked her down several times. The last time, she walked up the long driveway. After trying to get to her feet several times and failing, Jenny crawled the rest of the way to the front door. She didn't even have the strength to knock, which explained her slapping on the door. The aftermath of Hurricane Karen was traumatic for the west coast of Florida. Fortunately, my 2 interpreters survived the hurricane unharmed. We worked with FEMA and other agencies relaying emergency information. We were just one of many radio and TV stations serving the Tampa and St. Petersburg area, but we were the only station in our neighborhood helping local residents. We let people know where they could get food, water, and medical care. Then we announced when various stores, schools, and other services would be open. We received several awards from local officials and even one from the Tampa Chamber of Commerce. John and Helen returned to Newport Richey and found their home destroyed. Instead of rebuilding the house, they got an insurance payout and moved to Zephyrhills to be near us. When Jenny had fully recovered and we were once again a loving married couple, I asked her what she planned to do next. "I was wondering if you need an experienced salesman for your station?" she said with a smile. I chuckled and hugged Jenny tightly. Not only could I use the world's best salesman, but I have an idea on how to pay off Todd and Mr. Hammett. Hammett Communications had 2 radio stations in the Tampa/St. Petersburg market. So Jenny and I targeted the sponsors of those 2 stations. Mostly due to Jenny's charm and persuasiveness, but over the next 6 months we managed to poach 30% of the sponsors. Once I walked through the station door, Jenny threw herself into my arms. Her kiss pierced me all the way to my toes. "What are you so excited about?" I asked, stepping back. "2 things," she said, holding out a piece of paper. "The latest Arbitron rankings are out, and we've moved up to 8th place, ahead of both Hammett stations." "And the second one?" "I just got off the phone with Charles Hammett. He called to say he had just fired Todd and was sorry for the way he treated me. He wanted to know if I would consider coming back to Atlanta to take my old position." The smile disappeared from my face. "Oh, and what did you say to Charles?" I told him no. I have the best job in the world, and I work every day with the love of my life. It's been 10 years since Hurricane Helen, and life is pretty good. Jenny and I have the usual disagreements that any married couple has, but we always make up. The main difference is that Jenny is much more willing to admit when she's wrong. The only problem is that sometimes she's too quick to admit she's wrong when it's my fault. Tiffany earned a degree in communications and came to work at the station. After 3 years, I appointed her station manager. She is doing a great job, and soon we will be moving our studios to an office space in Tampa. Tiffany believes we need a presence in the city, and I agree with her. Aside from the sales staff that will be working in the space, we will only be doing 2 live shows, a morning show and an evening show. Tina graduated from Florida State University and got a job in Dade City, a small town of about 7,000 people just north of Zephyrhills. She works as a special education teacher, and she loves it. She is also married to a fellow teacher and they will have their firstborn in May. Charles Hammett died last year and his son took over as CEO of Hammett Communications. Richard was not like his father and had no interest in radio. He thought it was a dying industry. The same was said about newspapers, but about 27% of Americans still read them. About the same percentage listens to radio, but radio is much cheaper to operate than a newspaper. Anyway, Richard decided to sell all of Hammett's radio stations at the same time. This was not a smart business move. By putting so many stations up for sale at the same time, he seriously depressed the value of radio stations for sale across the country for several years. But his mistake became our opportunity. We bought WSTP, an FM station serving St. Petersburg, for $1.2 million. It was a 6,000-watt station that covered all of St. Petersburg and part of Tampa. Since the station was located south of St. Petersburg, we had no problem taking more than 50% of the market. Prior to the acquisition of WSTP, our annual gross revenue was over $8 million. I heard from Todd from time to time after he was laid off from Hammett Communications. He first tried to find a job in Atlanta, but when that failed, Todd returned to California. There he also failed to find a job in broadcasting, but he got a job as a new car salesman at a BMW dealership. And things were going well for Todd until he decided to sleep with a married customer whose husband had friends in very low circles. I haven't seen any pictures of Todd since the accident where he fell face-first through some windows, but I've been assured that his days of seducing married women are over. Our life was not perfect. I had to have an emergency appendectomy, and 6 months later I had to have my gallbladder removed. Jenny broke her wrist and knocked out 2 teeth when she fell on one of the parking curbs. Thank God Tiffany and Tina are healthy, as are their husbands and children. They have 2 children each. Tiffany has a boy and a girl, and Tina has 2 boys. John and I have taken up golf and we're terrible, but we're having a great time with the other 2 guys, Scott and Dan, who make up our foursome. Whoever has the worst score of the day has to pay for the first round. That's usually me. Funny how life works. One of the worst days of my life turned out to be the best. Firing my wife forced me to finally pursue my dream and succeed at it. Not only that, but creating a much stronger marriage and family. My father first told me this saying, but I have heard it many times since. The biggest regret in life is not that we failed, but that we didn't try at all.